Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another session of the Global Market Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. Please note that this session is being held in English with a simultaneous French interpretation. To access the interpretation, look out for the interpretation feature on your screen. Often looks like a globe icon. Select your preferred language and mute the original language. Also note that we are live on Facebook and on YouTube should you have interruption with the Zoom. We'd like to acknowledge our partners and sponsors who have made it possible for us to bring to you the Global Market Encounter every time. CNFA Pro Cashew, Cashew Info, GIZ.com Cashew, TechnoSafe Benin Cashew, SNI, Intersnack, and of course you, the participants, for joining us every session of the Global Market Encounter. Without wasting much time, I would like to invite Jim Fitzpatrick. Hello, Jim. Please go ahead with the session. Thank you.
Morning, Blessing. Thanks very much indeed. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. It's good to be with you again. Today, we're going to talk about markets, as always, and we're going to talk a little bit about value addition and high value addition. I'm going to pose a question around this idea of producing processed snack foods in African countries. So let's have a look at our agenda today. Market developments as usual, and the question we're going to pose is high-level value addition the way forward for African cashew processors? So underlying that is the thought that maybe by adding more value, maybe by producing a finished product, African cashew processors can be more competitive, and maybe that they can get around some of the issues around high levels of investment and large-scale factories. And we're really lucky to be joined by someone who's been there, done that, so to speak. Serge Panou, the co-founder of Talaro Global, a real go-ahead cashew business based in Benin and the United States. Let's talk markets for a while. But before we do, don't forget to join in. Raise your hand, ask a question, disagree, agree too if you want. Discuss any aspect. Use the chat, use the Zoom, use the facilities on the other platforms too. So what are this week's talking points? It hasn't been a particularly busy period over the last 2 weeks since we were with you last. Not a huge amount has changed. There are still few buyers in the market of kernels, but we don't see too much push from the top sellers. There's a little bit of, particularly from Europe, there's a little bit of top-up buying, there's a little bit of replacement buying, there's still problems of delays of shipments, there are still requests for extensions of contract. I think some of those low-price contracts are still out there, in doubt out there, under negotiation out there, who knows? Meantime, we do see some of the smaller and medium processors in Vietnam pushing a little bit for sales, a little bit like they did in the spring, a little bit like they did at the start of the pandemic last year. They're pushing into the vacuum. There's no buyers. If you push into the vacuum, all you do is knock the market down against yourself. And I wonder, is that happening with some of the quotes? Meantime, some qualified. What does qualified mean? It means ready to sell, food safe, certified, qualified. West African sellers are making prices $3.50. I even heard up as high as $3.60. And this is for shipments that are prompt, partly to do with the freight differential. We come to that. Partly to do with the shorter transit, but also to do with the diversification of supply chains by some of the buyers. As we'll see a little bit later, the US market imported 90% of its cashews from Vietnam in September. Looking at the freight situation, which is it's a huge factor still. The rates remain high. You can see in this little picture, I'll show you this actually. So these are the container vessels waiting outside Long Beach port. Long Beach is the port for Los Angeles on the west coast of the United States. These are the container vessels queued up and waiting as of last Monday morning outside the port to be discharged. So this problem hasn't gone away. It's particularly acute on the west coast of the US, but it's present everywhere. So rates remain high. It's about 23 cents a pound from Vietnam to European main ports at the moment. That's around $8,000. There is some easing of the port congestion. Some of the containers are moving on, but the position does remain critical. And that means long voyage times. That means containers are lying in the port. I even read in one report from a freight analyst that it even means that some of the containers will never be discharged. Those containers with low value cargoes may never be taken up. So long voyages, uncertainty, high prices, difficult times set to continue by all accounts, according to the freight market, according to the experts, according to the journalists. This is well set to continue into next year. So if you're lucky enough to be in an origin which doesn't have that problem, or at least doesn't have it to the same extent, this is a real opportunity. And it seems like for West Africa, for Mozambique, for Tanzania, if you're a processor, it does look as if this opportunity will still be there throughout the first 6 months of next year. Perhaps not to the same extent, but it looks like it will be there. Other talking points: demand, critical time of year for demand. It's a time of year when we can review demand. Diwali's just passed in India. We're looking at the busiest time of year in Europe and the United States. And between India, Europe, and the United States, we have about 80% of world cashew demand. So right now, we estimate that buyers are pretty well covered. The question would be whether they're covered to the Northern Hemisphere new crop. Looking at today's prices, I think they probably are. If they've got any sense, they probably are. There may be some doubt, though, because there may be some containers they're expecting that may not come on time and may not come at all. And that would be a question mark. In India, demand was, I think it was pretty normal, maybe normal to good, maybe some question marks here and there. And is there some restocking likely to continue post-Diwali? There is another peak coming in the early part of the year. In general, I think that buyers' approach to their cover on edible nuts, and particularly their cover on cashew nuts, might have shortened. So in the course of the pandemic, although demand has been very strong, it may well be the case that buyers have shortened the period of cover due to the uncertainty. That often happens. We saw that during the financial crisis, if you go back about 10 years, similar situation. 3 months, 6 months cover perhaps, but maybe this time there is a slight difference. Judging on the imports, people may have decided to carry some inventory. Interest rates are low, journeys are long, the origin situation is unclear. What does seem to be clear is that demand is pretty strong. If we look at the RCN market, it's the quieter time of year for that, as you know. Tanzanian auction is moving along. Auction prices were a little bit lower. I mean, the lower end of prices, let's say, was lower, about 870 last week, down from a previous low of 910. And then there's the upper end as well. So there's a range of prices every week. And the upper end has actually not changed, or actually moved up slightly higher, according to the Cashew Board of Tanzania. International prices are easing too. I don't believe there's a great deal of business going on, but we hear prices in the range of 1350, maybe actually 1340, up to 1530, depending on the origin. Mainly Cote d'Ivoire still selling a little, Guinea-Bissau, and of course Tanzania. But these prices appear to be too high for the kernels market, just on a very basic calculation. And that's difficult one. I mean, some people would say that raw cashew nuts are overpriced. Others would say that kernels are underpriced. But if we look at prices, let's have a look at RCN prices first. So what we're seeing is that prices have drifted down a little. If we look overall at the situation, you know, this index that I've mentioned to you, if you've been with us before, the red dotted line on the chart, this is a kind of a quality adjusted availability, price availability index. The only thing it doesn't take into account is the volumes available at any given moment. So we see that actually the index is higher than the Northern Hemisphere season. That means that, accepting that the nuts that are available from Tanzania in particular are of higher quality, but generally speaking, prices are slightly higher. We saw a decline in prices, and then we saw it turn around a little bit during the year. So springtime prices moved up, but they moved up from a very low level, which was never sustainable. And what we've seen now is a slight, then we saw stability, and now prices have drifted down a little bit. But this often happens. And if we go back and look over the years at the situation in Tanzania, it often opens at quite a high price, drifts down, and then finds its level. And right now, I would say it's probably finding its level. So you would, just on the history, you would look at the cost and freight offers, particularly the higher end offers for the higher quality material. And you might say the cost and freight prices are a little high and the auction prices are just about getting to where they should be. If we look at the raw cashew nuts versus kernels, what people often call the parity, which means if you buy raw cashew nuts today, how does that calculate in terms of the price of kernels? So we had a look at this, and we took Tanzanian raw cashew nuts at 15.30 based on 51 pounds, and Ivorian raw cashew nuts at 13.30 based on 46 pounds, maybe 46, 47. And essentially when you look at it, Tanzanian, that's the calculation. That's the calculation for Ivorian. So what this means is the average cost. So I take for Vietnam, I take a price of $200 per ton of raw cashew nuts for the cost of processing. And for India, I take 300. We all know there's lower in Vietnam. We all know there's lower in India, but we're trying to get to some kind of a reasonable average calculation. So when we look at this, what we see is that if we take the average price, so what you do is you take a basket of all the grades, you calculate roughly what the outturn will be, and then you make an average sale price if you were able to sell them all today. Of course, you're not. You can't sell all the grades at one moment, but at the same time, it's just a guideline calculation. And what it tells us is that from a Vietnamese point of view in the international market, the realization at this very moment in time is lower than the cost of the raw material. So that can be an indication either that the raw cashew nuts are too high in price or that kernels are too low in price. India, on the other hand, is just about parity. Now, there's a big difference in the two processing origins. So Vietnam processors mainly are trading on forward business. So they're mainly trading on sales they've made earlier. And those could be at much lower prices if they were made last March, or if they were made in September, they could be much higher prices. So this is just a parity. It's a snapshot of today. In India, the market generally works on much more prompt spot deliveries because that's the way domestic markets tend to work everywhere. And therefore, for India, if there's a mismatch of the parity, it might be a much more serious situation, in so much as that in India, we have a much higher kernels market. Let's have a look at the 320 prices. So if you look at the kernels market in India, you have much higher levels for 320s, which obviously works based on raw cashew nuts, but then you have to take all of the other grades into account too. So the international level, I've taken 310, and I know below 310 is available, or at least it's talked about. But I mean, we have to have a standard when we make such a calculation. And this would be medium, someone with a reasonable reputation, reasonable food safety. I think that's about the price today. Of course, it's unlikely that you'll get a top processor with a BRC or some sort of certification of that level available with product to sell because they've already sold it. If we look at the African situation, African 320s, West African 320s today are somewhere between the Vietnamese price and the Indian domestic price. And as I said, that reflects differences in freight, differences in shipping time, differences in availability of the products. The conclusion is that the market on kernels does still appear to be a little bit undervalued, to my mind. People may well argue that Tanzanian raw cashew nuts are too high price in the international market, perhaps not at the auction, maybe in the international market. But I think looking overall at prices, the more accurate conclusion is that kernels are probably undervalued. And some people will say that kernels are systemically undervalued, that cashew kernels at anywhere below $4 just don't make sense. And if you look at sometimes at retail prices, and that's actually what brings us to the question that we're going to ask about value addition. If you look at retail prices, there's good reason to think that maybe in the international market, prices for cashew kernels generally are a little bit too low. So looking at the price trend, you see that prices have drifted down a little bit. Now I'm taking Vietnam as the benchmark here. I have not built in higher prices in West Africa, which are real and are happening, but I haven't built it in here because we're talking about relatively low volumes. So if we were to average it out based on the volumes, the impact of the African prices on the big picture would be relatively low. We should, I guess, adjust this for the freight costs to make comparisons. So if we take, again, our benchmark grade 320s, and we look at the 5-year average, the 2-year average, and yesterday's pricing, basis Vietnam, basis cost and freight, European main port I've taken here as the benchmark in this case. What we see is that because of the freight, prices are now a little bit above and have been, of course, above the 2-year average for some time, but they're well below the 5-year average. So it's mainly due to freight. If we look at prices in terms of the FOB to FOB over the years, you would say today's levels are very, very attractive. Now there's nothing we can do about freight. There's nothing buyers can do about freight right now, except wait and hope that it gets better. But that doesn't seem to be likely. So it seems to me that probably these lower prices we're hearing from Vietnam reported by the brokers are a little bit overdone, maybe sign of a little bit of panic. There could always be sign of a little bit of an effort to put pressure onto the value of raw cashew nuts onto that market. It could be just a need to move product on, turn product into cash after a period of lockdowns for some of the factories. But having said all of that, Vietnamese exports are at record levels. So it's difficult to argue that there's a shortage of cash in a market where exports are at record levels. Let's have a look at demand. I decided this week I'd focus on the US because there's an interesting story unfolding there. So this is US imports month by month. So this is month by month during each of the last 2 years and this year. And you can see that we've, again, so the red one is 2021, monthly imports into the United States. And what you can see very clearly in the last 3 months is a real surge in imports. Now, these are imports, so that would mean that those products were shipped probably starting maybe as early as last April or April, May, given the longer voyage times at the moment. Looking at this, what we're seeing is probably a decision by buyers to ship early, to ship more, to ship it early in order to make sure they had enough product in. Certainly you need to ship early this year in order to meet the peak demand periods. But what's really interesting, and these are the forecasts for imports for October, November, and December, the yellow bars. When you look at shipments from Vietnam, so for October, I took July, August, November, August, Sep, and December, Sep, Aug. If you look at those, the forecast would be that US imports will continue to be quite strong for the rest of the year. Now, this is quite interesting. If we look at September, it was up 18.4% versus 2020, and 2020 was not a bad year. As you can see, it was a slightly different year. We saw the peak in imports in 2020 early in the year, and then it eased off as the year went on, although it was, with the exception of July and August, every month in 2020 was better than the previous year. It's been the highest September for imports on record, and over the period of July, August, September, the import into the US has gone from about par with last year, about no change, to plus 9% year to date. If we look at US imports, the cumulative situation, we're looking at 2021 being a record year by our calculations. So that's based on what's already shipped from Vietnam, and it would hit 182,000 tons by the end of the year. That's really quite remarkable. And this, I think, shows some serious changes in demand. Not so long ago that we were talking about the US as a mature market, growing slowly, growing much more slowly than Europe, for example. And now we see fast growth returning to the US market. So based on the shipments from Vietnam, we're forecasting about a 9.5% increase in imports. And if we look at that in terms of the trend, it's interesting to look back and see in 2018, we had a slight decline. 2019, it was up 7.9%. Last year, it was up 1.4%. And this year up 9.46% again. So I think there's a couple of things at work here. One is stability of price and attractive prices, very important in the US market. Secondly, the impact of the pandemic, which we saw back in the spring of last year, in March, April, May of last year, we saw much higher imports into the United States. And this year we've seen it, as you can see here in the top left, we've seen that happen in July, August, and September. And that's it. You know, we'd normally expect that October, November, December would be much calmer, but we know what's shipped from Vietnam. We have a good idea of how long it takes to get to the US, and it does appear as if we'll see a pretty good import performance there. January, February, March might be another question. You might see an easing off there, but that will depend on the situation. And I think if we see a continuation of the freight problems, you might see something a little quieter market in January, February, March. But that's by no means certain. And of course, the pandemic is by no means certain. We've seen surge in cases now again in Europe. We could see that in the United States, and who knows what that might do to the psychology of the market in terms of the shipments. One thing's for sure, the combination of these kind of demand trends and the current trend in demand with prices as they are, around 310 is a really attractive price for 320s. Looking at those two things, you would expect that demand growth will continue. The real, let's say, enemy of demand growth is price volatility. And if we were to see prices sky high sometime next year, as happens from time to time, it last happened in 2017, if we were to see that again, that would slow demand. Good news all around on demand on the one hand, but there is some bad news on the other hand. And if we look at the situation, US, the African import market share. So if we look at this and we think about the imports into the United States from African countries, we've seen a downward trend, and it's not just 2020. 2020 is quite a serious downward trend, but that is probably due to reduced processing, especially in the early part of the year in African countries. So what we're seeing right now is that the Africa's share of the US market has declined as the US market has grown. It peaked in 2015. There was a 4.1% market share in 2015. About 6,300 tons of kernels were imported, and it's drifted since then. And if we look at the market share, we possibly should leave 2020 out, but even so, there is a slight decline, 3.18% in 2019, and that's really not good enough. And it's hard to know what's doing that, but the question, the elephant in the room, so to speak, is why have African countries not shared in US demand growth? Now, it could be that the US market is more price sensitive. It could be that US buyers and importers are less likely to be present in the African market. It could be the trade in former kernels. I think that's a seriously negative and even dangerous trend for African processing. This is where unpeeled kernels are shipped to Vietnam to be finished and re-exported. But it is a question to be answered. And I'm not saying, by the way, it's a question for buyers to answer. This is a question for African processors to answer. Why are we not seeing an increased tonnage into the United States? If the market share was declining or static, that's one thing. But the market share is declining, and that's combined with a reduction in tonnage. That would be the concern. Okay, so let's have a look at the raw cashew nuts again. Let's have a look at the Tanzanian situation. So the Tanzanian auction, they're telling us about 123,000 tons sold as of last week. That means sales are about the same as last year. So in the yellow bars, you can see sales building up the 8th, the 15th, the 30th, 12th of November, last Friday. And then comparing that to last year, at the end of October, it was about the same as last year. 12th of November, it's slightly ahead of last year. The arrivals, though, are ahead of last year, and we estimate somewhere between 137 and 157,000 tons to be sold, less a little, which will go to local processing. You would, though, be asking a question that with the increased crop expectations, I mean, we've based the tons to be sold on a crop estimate, the range of crop estimates from 260 to 280,000 tons. You would have to say that maybe there is a question mark over the size of the Tanzanian crop this year. We're now past the middle of November, and maybe you would have expected to see a little bit more material arriving. Time will tell. Let's hope it's a good crop. Let's hope it's more like 2019 than it's like 2020. If we look at the prices, we can see prices are a little bit lower, as you would expect. The market is a little bit lower generally. Auction prices on the 12th of November, lower than a year ago. And we see there has been a slight decline in prices, as you would expect. So the red is the low end price that's been reported, and the blue is the high end price. And these are the auction prices. So auction prices are ex-warehouse. That's before the loading, before the freight, before the high export tax from Tanzania. So we're looking at a straightforward auction price. It has all of those additional costs of the auction in there, but it doesn't have any of the on costs for shipment. So if we say that Tanzanian prices are a little bit lower, especially at the high end, let's just go back and have a look at the RCN market. And does that reflect the market? Possibly not. The market last year was about the same price as it is now, and thereafter it fell, and the Tanzanian auction fell. So maybe you could say that the auction is running a little bit ahead of the market at this moment in time. Doesn't mean it'll fall or nothing like that, but it does mean that it needs to be closely watched. So I would be asking a question about the Tanzanian crop, whether it will, certainly I think that the higher end of the estimate is probably unlikely to happen now. You'd hope that the lower end, 260,000 tons, is exceeded. So that's the market. So we're looking at a situation where we have a quite good sales of Tanzanian raw cashew nuts in a quiet kernels market, and where the international price of cashew kernels have been slipping a little bit. I always like to mention the environmental impact of the cashew business, and I believe that we have to be more and more conscious of this, and there are certain things in our business that shout out hazard and shout out negative impact. The raw cashew nut trade, the international raw cashew nut trade, about 1.5 million tons doing this 28,000 kilometer journey. Something that's less of a problem, but still something to be looked at, is the emissions, what goes up the chimney in factories, particularly if you burn cashew shells, particularly if you burn cashew shells without properly removing the cashew nut shell liquid beforehand. The third aspect that we need to consider is, where are trees planted? We have to consider biodiversity, the suitability of the land, or other trees being felled in order to plant cashew trees, and the impact of that. People need to make a living. We also need to consider the impact on the environment. And generally, cashews can be very positive, but there are certain aspects which I'd like to highlight here that may be negative for the environment. And finally, the use of byproducts, and especially the use of cashew shells, cashew nut shell liquid, the use of it as a fuel, or is it a valuable natural chemical? And I tend to think that the valuable natural chemical is a much higher value item and a much better argument. So in summary, we look at our November, December update expectations. I think that the RCN market will remain steady, but it may correct a little bit. In other words, we might see some small reductions in price on the availability. I don't expect there to be too much activity in kernels in the short term. Over the next couple of weeks, we have holidays coming up in the US. We have a European market which is heads down working, and we don't see that the Chinese market is well ahead of last year, but we don't see the Chinese market especially busy. And similarly in India, this time of year, we might see the market take a little bit of a breather. Freight rates, they may stabilize, they probably have stabilized at the moment, but there's continued disruption. And by the way, stabilized is not good news, because it's stabilized at very high prices. So I think that what we will see is fairly measured buying from India, careful buying, making sure to work their way through to the new crop, that the Indian buyers will be careful what they buy on RCN. We won't see too many people chasing the market too hard. Probably India has still got some buying to do. Vietnam is difficult to work out. On paper, Vietnam looks as if it's covered on raw cashew nuts through to the middle of next year. But in reality, we know that's not right. I don't think the Vietnamese need an awful lot. I think there's probably enough raw cashew nuts to go through. Tanzanian crop should sell. Some of the Mozambique crop for export should sell. And I guess some of the stocks lying in Vietnam will be tidied up. Demand for kernels remains very strong, but buyers, as we can see from the import figures, and I'll show you next time the European import figures, they're pretty similar to the US figures. Demand is strong, buyers are pretty well stocked, I think, and we're not likely to see any panic from their point of view. The question for me is, how long can kernels prices stay at these low levels? Difficult one to answer. I asked someone that question recently. They gave me the very direct answer. He said to me, until the buyers are ready, Jim. Well, maybe so. So I think we need to keep an eye on the activity of buyers in the kernels market, but I don't expect that to happen over the next couple of weeks. That's the market situation as we see it right now. We're going to have a look at the second question. So why do we ask this question? We ask it because we are seeing a number of successful projects in this area. We are seeing a number of processors develop additional processing, roasting, consumer packing, and we are seeing some success in this area. Is it for everyone? Is it the way forward for everyone? That's the real question that we want to get at. And we have to look a bit more fundamentally at the business in order to understand the answers. So first of all, what are cashew kernels used for? Well, outside of India, the vast bulk are consumed simply as snacks. Roasted, salted cashews, plain cashews, sometimes flavored cashews. In this kind of packaging, so this is a European packaging, I think it is from Germany, a UK packaging, and a famous brand in chocolate. But the first two would be a typical use of cashews all around the world, maybe outside of India. Point is that it's a relatively straightforward process to roast cashews. Does that mean that they should be roasted and salted at the origin? And we know there is some of that going on in Vietnam. We know there's been one or two examples in India for many years, and very successful examples too. And we know that there are examples in African countries, in Mozambique, in Benin, and also in Cote d'Ivoire. So the use of cashews might well lend itself to the idea of origin high-level value addition. If we look at what do cashew consumers want, well, we know they want a quality product. We know they'd like to have a resilient and diversified supply chain. We know food safety is an absolute. Traceability and transparency is becoming an absolute requirement. We know they want price stability. How do we know that? Well, we know it because they buy more when prices are stable. Demand goes up. And we know that increasingly, well, it's hardly increasingly now, it's everywhere. Buyers want compliance in human rights, particularly for labor, and they want to find a positive, or at least not a negative, impact on the environment. So we must ask the question, does the market help them to get those needs? And to a certain extent, the answer is no. The market doesn't help with the diversified short supply chain. It doesn't help with traceability. It doesn't help with price stability. And it doesn't help with labor and environmental compliance. So again, we find a trend that maybe lends itself to higher value addition in African countries. And if we look at the supply chain, processing, roasting, salting, packing at origin might well address some of those issues, the concentration of processing, the increased risk by processing the cashew nuts so far from where they grow. You know, just think about it. If all cashews grown in West Africa were processed in West Africa, there'd be no issue on freight today. If we looked at how the RCN trade impacts, yes, certainly origin high value addition would start to address that issue too. And it might even end up being a help in price volatility, which in turn would be of assistance in product development. So high level value addition at the origin is in line with certain of the trends. Let's look at how that value is distributed. So I'm going to show you a chart which I compiled thanks to Cashew, Competitive Cashew Initiative, and thanks to them for this. So if we look at the split, where does the money go? And this is on 1 kilo of wholes, 320s more than likely, roasted and salted cashew kernels, grown in Cote d'Ivoire, processed in Vietnam, and consumed in Germany. And if we look at this, we can see where the money ends up. So there's a lot of it is in the retailer's gross margin and in sales tax at destination. There's not much we can do about that. The roaster has costs and hopefully a profit margin, which are quite significant. How much is cost? How much is profit margin? Well, that's another discussion because it's different for every business. But that's significant, and it's that high level value addition would want to focus on. And if we look at the rest of it, what ends up with the processor in Vietnam, what is spent on transport, export taxes, margins for raw cashew nut traders, there's significant value in this area, which could be transferred to a processor at origin. That's the profile based on grown in Cote d'Ivoire, processed in Vietnam, consumed in Germany. If we have a look at the opposite, so this is processed in Cote d'Ivoire and grown in Cote d'Ivoire and consumed in Germany, but not roasted. We're just talking here about the basic primary processing. And again, none of the destination costs change, but the processor ends up with a little bit higher margin. And the way things are at the moment, the farmer doesn't end up particularly better off on that calculation. That's not because the processor doesn't pay the farmer a fair price. The processor pays the farmer the market price, but that market price is not set in Cote d'Ivoire or anywhere else in West Africa. That market price is set based on the costs of bringing the product to India or to Vietnam for processing. So what we see in these two is, again, a positive answer to our question that there is significant value that could be retained at the origin. And if we look at that in a slightly different way, and we see where value is added. So this is a waterfall chart, again, thanks to Cashew, and this shows the buildup. And you can see that there's significant value addition and cost. So don't forget that this is not just profit. This is value addition, it's cost, it's gross margin, all in there. It does not tell the story of profitability. It tells the story of how prices become higher the further we go down the chain. And again, you see significant value that could be retained in the origin. So far, we're looking at trends that may well suggest that this is a good idea or that it's possible. And let's have a look a little bit more at the technical side. And firstly, at food safety. So at the farmer level, there's not a lot of difference. You want to see good agricultural practices. At the assembler, dryer, trader level, again, not much difference. Processors everywhere should have food safety certification, a minimum of HACCP to access markets, but they can also work with something like an ISO or an FSSC 22000. But once you get into roasting and consumer packing, you need to move to a different level. Food safety needs to be at a much higher level. You need to have a high level BRC or an IFS or similar certification. And if you start to pack retail packs, you need to start thinking about product liability. How do you deal with rejections? How do you deal with returns? And there are always returns. How do you deal with a product recall? So the food safety aspect becomes very complex. Once you move from primary processing, removing the shell, removing the testa, grading the cashews, cleaning the cashews, perhaps fumigating them, the bridge from that primary process into secondary processing is a major change in the attitude to food safety. And you then have all the additional responsibilities in food safety, not only dealing with returns, but in the event of a product recall. So we're talking here about a much more complex operation. And there's a big question mark over at this point in time, whether or not African processors are capable of that. If we look at some of the trends in the market, of course, there are so many trends that are in favor of origin processing. The types of consumption, conscience-driven consumption, pick out a few. Conscience-driven consumption, decommoditization, sustainability, traceability. All of those things would tend to lend themselves toward the idea of full value addition at origin in African countries. And if we look a little bit closer, if we look at some of the trends and some of the things we see in packaging, and by the way, look at the packaging. It's not so easy to achieve packaging at that level. Trends like convenience, storytelling, gluten-free, vegetarian, vegan, organic, all of those things would be helpful in origin processing. I mean, you certainly would have a great, and we're going to hear from Serge soon, and he's going to tell us his story. And that's a great story to tell, and telling the story of the product is really powerful marketing. If we look at the pandemic, is there anything in the pandemic which has increased the opportunity towards this type of business? Well, there are some, and there are not others. But if we look at it, reducing the complexity of the supply chain, increasing traceability and security of supply, those three would certainly lend themselves to high value addition at as close to the point of growing as possible. But as I've said, issues of food safety and quality are technical issues that need to be addressed. So in the pandemic, there would be a trend toward full origin processing, but it's very difficult to meet that trend. And if we look at the technology, so when we look at the technology of roasting and packaging, whereas in the food business, you would not say this is a particularly high tech or particularly difficult task. But for a primary processor, a cashew sheller, peeler, grader, to go to this level, it is quite a huge journey. It's much more complex. It requires additional investment, and it requires a lot of knowledge and ability to keep these machines running at the high capacities that they demand. So we've trends on the one hand in favor of the idea, but we have the technical realities tending to lean against it: food safety, quality, technology, and most of all, marketing. So when it comes to marketing, from a secondary processing point of view, there's some huge impacts here. Communicating the message, communicating the quality, especially if you want to go with a branded product. The story of origin will bring you so far, but after that, it needs to be a story of quality. It needs to be a story of innovation. It needs to be a story of great packaging and great marketing. And when we look at marketing, there may be issues around the cost of marketing, or indeed the cost of credit. If you're selling to retailers, they tend to look for credit. Where is your product placed? What makes it sell? Who buys it? Who are you aiming at? What kind of a product? How do you get into the supermarkets? How do you get it to online retailers? Can you get it on Amazon? So the challenge of marketing, and we spoke, if you were with us 2 sessions ago, we talked about the lack of marketing scale or the lack of attention to marketing in a lot of the African cashew industry. Secondary value addition ups the ante. It makes the need for high quality marketing all the greater. So it becomes a very, very challenging task for anyone, not only for a primary processor. So if we look at the balance on this, on the one hand, we have the opportunity for greater value addition, a shorter supply chain, a more sustainable supply chain, and perhaps a reduction of risk by addressing those areas of the supply chain that currently have problems. But on the other side, we have challenges in the technology, challenges in food safety, challenges in marketing, and not least of all, and this is one I often see as a problem when I talk to people, is the idea of returns. You get a product rejected at a supermarket. In Europe, for example, what do you do about it? It's packed, it's ready to go, it's got a shorter shelf life. You're the seller, you really need to be organized to do that. So there's pluses and minuses. The pluses are in all of the trends in the market. And the negative side are in all the technical aspects. So let's talk to someone who knows a bit more about this. And let's ask Serge how he sees it. I'd like to draw your attention to Talaro Global. Talaro this is their homepage. It's well worth a visit. Cashews with a Conscience. And it tells the story of their business. And I'm going to have a chat with Serge. Can you hear me, Serge?
Oui, je vous reçois.
Good morning. Good morning. How are you?
Bonjour. Bon, je vais bien, merci. Bonjour, Jim.
Yeah, I'm okay. Same old, same old. So the Talaro is a really impressive business. I've had the pleasure of working with you once or twice. I've worked with your colleague Jace. You're one of the few cashew processors in Africa adding value by roasting and packing. I've mentioned some of the technical challenges. What were the technical challenges in establishing this kind of processing?
Non, merci, je dirais tout de suite comme défi technique. Je vais les résumer en 3 grands points. Les ressources humaines, la maintenance et les certifications. Alors, j'ai mis les ressources humaines au premier point, simplement parce que il ne faut jamais qu'on ignore le fait que l'Afrique est en train de faire la transformation dans un environnement défavorable. C'est-à-dire quoi? C'est-à-dire que le personnel qualifié pour l'agroalimentaire de bout en bout n'existe pas dans tous les compartiments de l'industrie agroalimentaire. Donc, ça, c'est déjà un grand bien. Et ça a été l'un des grands défis auxquels nous avons fait face et dont nous faisons encore face. On a dû former beaucoup de personnel dans ce sens. Et le deuxième aspect, c'est par rapport aux finances qui sont dans les ressources humaines, c'est-à-dire que le service financier. Alors, aujourd'hui, malheureusement, en tant que promoteur, vous êtes obligé de tout savoir. Vous êtes obligé de vous auto-former dans tous les domaines. Et tout à l'heure, j'ai suivi avec beaucoup d'intérêt votre présentation. Au-delà de tout ce qui est dit, si tout ceci n'est pas clairement transcrit sur papier, avec des chiffres clairs, c'est compliqué pour le promoteur s'il n'a pas comment on appelle, des guides à suivre. Je veux donner comme exemple. L'acajou en général, il entre en noix et il sort en 26 grades. Donc, pour les finances, tout ce qui a été fait, tous les business plans, vous pouvez le constater, tous les plans d'affaires par rapport à l'industrie de cajou se basent la plupart du temps sur du 320, c'est-à-dire un seul grade, qui n'est malheureusement pas le grade le moins cher. Du coup, ça biaise tout et l'entrepreneur, il s'entremet. Donc, c'est important, niveau ressources humaines, de vraiment s'appesantir sur qui sera le financier et comment ça se fait, de sorte à ce qu'ils comprennent très bien. Parce qu'il peut être un meilleur financier ayant travaillé dans des industries, mais pour l'agroalimentaire, spécifiquement pour le cajou, c'est complètement différent. Alors, donc, à ramasser pour les ressources humaines, c'est ça. Maintenant, niveau maintenance, il faut dire que au-delà du manque d'équipement à disposition, du manque de pièces de rechange, le plus gros problème au niveau de la maintenance est que nous n'avons pas de support pour entretenir les équipements qui sont importés. Donc, du coup, on est obligé soit de bricoler, soit de faire former les gens, ce qui n'est pas toujours facile. Pourquoi? Parce que l'Europe et les États-Unis, qui sont la plupart demandeurs des noix, ne sont pas fabricants pour les équipements de base. Les équipements de base sont la plupart fournis par l'Asie. Et pour ma petite expérience, beaucoup d'équipements viennent sans recommandation, sans notice. Non pas parce qu'elles n'ont pas, mais simplement parce que les autres n'ont aucun intérêt à ce qu'on puisse avoir ces documents et nous former. Donc, c'est compliqué lorsque vous n'avez pas une maintenance, ça fait des surcoûts et ça plombe le coût de production. Maintenant, en ce qui concerne le troisième aspect, qui est l'aspect certification, oui, c'est vrai, j'ai vu quand même beaucoup de certifications, BRC, IFS et autres. Mais il faut à ce niveau également nuancer. Pour dire que beaucoup d'entrepreneurs commencent d'abord leur entreprise, mettre en place d'abord leur entreprise avant de parler de la certification. Honnêtement, ce qui est une très mauvaise chose. Je comprends. Par ignorance, on le fait également pour limiter les coûts, on le fait. Ce qui aurait été bien, serait été qu'on fasse d'abord les recherches et une bonne connaissance de certification à avoir avant même de démarrer la construction du bâtiment pour après éviter les surcoûts. Donc, cette certification dont on a besoin pour aller sur les marchés internationaux, elle est compliquée à mettre en place parce que nous n'avons pas des auditeurs, ou du moins presque pas, d'auditeurs locaux pour certifier, pour nous certifier. Quand je prends l'exemple de BRC, il n'y a pas d'auditeurs locaux pour la certification BRC. Il faut, ça fait 3 mois environ que nous travaillons au renouvellement de notre certificat et c'est dernièrement qu'on a pu avoir un auditeur qui est accepté de nous faire l'audit avant décembre. Donc, c'est ces 3 aspects-là, en résumé, que je dirais que ce sont vraiment les challenges auxquels nous faisons face au quotidien.
Thank you, Serge. It's really interesting. I mean, building on what you've said, do you think that the preparation of consumer-packed snack foods and other ingredients in African countries can work? I know you're doing it at Tularo. What's your longer term view on it? Is this the way forward for African cashew processing?
La réponse, elle est toute simple. Il n'y a même pas à se poser de questions. Sans ça, la transformation de notre cajou, autant l'arrêter tout de suite. Si on ne peut pas aller jusqu'au produit fini à envoyer directement dans les supermarchés internationaux, vraiment, ce n'est pas la peine. Ceci étant, il y a beaucoup de choses en amont sur lesquelles il faudrait quand même qu'on revienne. Parce que, j'ai suivi tout à l'heure, lorsque le présentateur parlait de la valeur ajoutée dans différents domaines du producteur jusqu'au détaillant. Oui, c'est vrai, c'est exact. Mais le réel problème, il se situe d'abord à deux niveaux. Le premier, le transformateur vend son produit, comme je l'ai dit, à quasiment près de 26 prix différents. Ça veut dire quoi? Ça veut dire que lorsque le produit il est exporté pour faire du beurre, de la farine et tout ça, il est vendu à un prix fixe. Je vous donne un exemple simple. Peut-être une tartine de cajou autour de 10 $, le pot de 250 grammes, peut-être avec quelques autres mélanges. Mais ce même produit que le grossiste ou bien le transformateur européen achète ici, il achète en brisé. Il achète en brisé. Et ce brisé, il achète autour de 1,50 $ la livre. Alors, ce n'est pas de sa faute s'il fait du bénéfice, c'est normal. J'aurais fait la même chose à sa place. Mais aujourd'hui, il faudrait qu'on comprenne que ces produits qui ne pourront pas égaler les 320, les 240 et autres, minimum, ces produits doivent être transformés ici. Alors, lorsqu'on dit ça et qu'on comprend que c'est une question de la nature même de la noix, le deuxième aspect, maintenant, comment percer le marché? Oui, c'est vrai que la demande est forte et tout ça. Mais il faut dire que les marchés internationaux ne sont pas aussi perméables que ça. Les restrictions par rapport aux certifications, ça c'est un aspect. Mais on ne peut pas en faire un mythe, le fait que le produit qui vient de l'Afrique, directement pour le supermarché européen, ce n'est pas par décret que les structures qui vérifient la FDA et consorts, ce n'est pas par décret qu'ils vont les accepter. Il faut qu'on ait le mérite en justifiant de ce que ces produits sont de grande qualité. Et là, ça pose un réel problème. Le réel problème parce qu'au-delà de la certification, même, il y a des petits détails. On a parlé tout à l'heure de l'emballage, qui doit être joli, qui doit raconter une histoire. Oui, tout ça, c'est vrai. Mais ça a un coût énorme. Et ce coût, il faut déjà le préparer au démarrage et au développement du produit. Ce qu'aujourd'hui, quasiment aucune entreprise n'a. Donc, si je mets tout ça à bout en bout, il est important qu'on soit sur ces marchés, mais il est important également qu'on n'occupe pas les difficultés qu'il y a et que pour démarrer ça, il faut vraiment que ceux qui ont déjà l'expérience de la chose puissent les dire pour que ceux qui doivent faire ne reprennent pas les mêmes erreurs et que ceux qui sont là également puissent partager ces expériences et corriger ce qu'il y a à faire. Parce que nous faisons, certes, nous sommes sur tous ces marchés, mais ce n'est pas sans difficulté.
Thanks, Serge. That's very valuable and much appreciated. So let's move on for a moment. Blessing, have you any questions for us?
Yes, Jim, I have quite a few questions for you. Some are in the Q&A, and then some came from other channels. Maybe we should address the ones in the Q&A first before moving to the others. Okay, the first question, is somebody's actually requesting for you to re-explain the slide on RCN versus kernel parity.
Sure, okay. Okay, so this is the slide I guess that you're asking about. So what we've tried to do here is we've tried to calculate for India on the left and for Vietnam on the right. Three scenarios. Scenario one is the average cost of kernels based on today's raw nuts market for Tanzanian raw nuts. That's in orange in both cases. In yellow, the same calculation, the average cost of kernels. So this is take the cost of the raw material, take the cost of processing, take an average outturn yield, and you get to an average cost of kernels, not for any particular grade, just for all of the grades together. And then finally do the same calculation based on the current kernels market. So the orange is if you processed Tanzanian raw nuts in India at about $300 per ton cost of processing, per raw nut ton of processing, then same for Ivory Coast material, and then take the market price. And the point of this is, when we talk about parity, what we mean to ask the question is, if today I bought a shipment of Tanzanian raw cashew nuts, could I today sell them and make a profit or even make my money back? And the conclusion is, in the Indian domestic market, I could. But in the Vietnamese or in the international market, because that market is so much lower, that it would be difficult to do that. So that the cost of raw material today doesn't match the potential sales ability of the kernels in the market. And the reason for that is because, well, I'm going to say the reason for it is the price of kernels. Other people might say the reason for that is the price of raw cashew nuts. But if I look at just the three examples, the international FOB price primarily set in Vietnam around $3.10, or actually lower than that from some. The Indian domestic market, and the Indian domestic market is always higher than the international market. And then the prices at which some West African, as I call them, qualified West African processors are able to sell around about $3.50. So what it means is that orange and yellow bars are cost, green is sales revenue, average sales revenue per pound, as we price per pound in this business for some archaic reason. And if looking at that, what the conclusion is that for a Vietnamese processor, if they were today to buy a ton of either Ivorian or Tanzanian raw cashew nuts and try and resell that immediately, it will be difficult to make a profit. And then I made the point that, of course, most people sell forward, so they're dealing with contracts that they've sold some time ago, which may be at higher prices. So are they making money? Actually, we're not sure. You know, and if you don't mind, Blessing, I just see another question there in the text. Maybe I could go on and just discuss that at the same time. And
yes, go ahead.
That question is, the questioner asks, with shipments increasing monthly from Vietnam and making not much or no profits, are they just burning cash and running toward bankruptcy? Well, are they running tight? For sure. But bear in mind that the cost of processing in Vietnam for the bigger efficient processors is quite low. They've sold their kernels forward, so they may have sold them at much higher levels. A top processor is making more than $3.10, even in today's market. So I don't think that Vietnamese cashew processors at this moment in time are making vast fortunes, but I think in general, they've done okay and they have been making money. You would have to say that the nature of the business there is that there is an element of speculation. A lot of people, we talked about this going way back to the start of the season, a lot of people would have sold forward and then come to cover the raw nuts. If you take India, on the other hand, people are generally forced to buy their raw material and then they sell it out step by step. But they live in a protected market. The market is protected by high import tariffs. So even though Indian processing probably on average, and this wouldn't apply to all, but probably on average is a higher cost processing per ton basis, because the type of market that Indian processors operate in, mainly domestic, mainly high priced, mainly protected, it's probably easier and less speculative in its nature. In Vietnam, you can do very well, and some of them have done brilliantly. And let's not forget, they've built the biggest industry in the world in less than 30 years in the cashew sector. It's just a remarkable achievement. But today, I'd kind of agree with the subtext of the questioner that there is financial pressure in Vietnam, and that it's difficult to make money out of cashews at this moment in time. Blessing. Any other questions?
Yes, Jim, we have other questions. There's one in the chat that says, at current kernel prices, there isn't a good workable price on kernels unless we see good price rise in kernel prices. Do you feel RCN could correct further?
I think RCN could correct. Yeah, I think RCN could correct, but I wouldn't be looking for big falls in RCN prices. There is enough material around, but there's not we're not looking at a vast surplus here. Personally, I feel that once we get past this quiet period, it's more likely that kernels prices will pick up a little bit. That's not to say that RCN should pick up. The right situation at the moment would be, I expect that RCN prices would drift down a little bit and kernels would pick up. That may not happen until after the big holiday season in Western countries now, starting in the United States towards the end of November. That carries through December. It may be after that we see a pickup. The quietest month of the year traditionally for cashew buying is February. So the temptation for buyers would be to wait and see how the new crop moves through. I wouldn't be at all surprised to see some pressure on kernels prices as the new crop comes through, but be careful of that. That is, for me, that's a buying opportunity. For me, this market, on what we know now, is likely to move up. Kernels prices are good value. I think this current dip in prices will be short-lived, and that will tend to enforce RCN prices. But having said that, fundamentally, at this moment, RCN prices are probably a little bit overdone. And again, to stress the point, it's the offered price that looks too high. It's not actually the price at the auction in Tanzania that looks too high. So be careful of the fact that there's probably a lot of people carrying inventory of RCN, and they need to support that market for the time being. So it's neither one nor the other, as always in every market. There's a number of factors here that are going to contribute. But one thing I would say, I would not be selling kernels short at these prices, and I would not be building a stock of raw cashew nuts at these prices. I would avoid speculation in the current market.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. The same person has asked a follow-up question, which says, consumption patterns have changed the world over in kernels. Will there be a different season? Will there be a different season of consumption from here? There's a follow-up question.
Okay, well, I think the pattern hasn't hugely changed. What's happened is that it started to grow quicker. I mean, India is still the dominant market, and there's not going to be a seasonal change in India. It's very clearly based on seasonality, on certain festivals. on affluence and development of the economy. If we look in Western Europe, United States, similar situation, I don't see a huge change. But what we may well see as cashews become more and more popular is that the seasonality becomes smoothed out a little bit, and you see that demand is much more year round. So for example, trends in convenience, trends in vegetable proteins, you would definitely see those as much in January as in July, August, September. So you definitely will see a flattening of the seasonality in those markets, I think. But there still will be an end of year peak on what we know. There is not, it's not only cashews that happens on, it's a whole range of food items, and that won't change. What might also be interesting to keep a good eye on is the demand trends in China. China has been growing quickly in the last couple of years, very quickly this year. As that continues, we might have to have a look and see some seasonal peaks, maybe in the spring or the Northern Hemisphere spring, when you get festivals in China, and again, earlier towards the end of the year, again, when you have another festival in China. So look out for China. Today, the Chinese market's probably about half the size of the US market, but it looks like it may well catch up. However, if we were to get high prices again, that might slow the growth in demand in China. So there are changes, but at this moment in time, they're prospects rather than actualities.
Thank you, Jim. Jim, please, can we go on to the slide 11 of your presentation? There is a question on that slide. Somebody wants to know how much RCN prices drift down for every 1,000 tons of RCN SS stock.
Slide 11 is about the environment.
Okay, then I think the person, just a moment, let me look at the slide the person was referring to. I think slide 11 actually is November to December 2021 update. That is the slide the person was referring to. Where you have November to December 2021 update.
Okay, so run the question by me again, Blessing, if you wouldn't mind.
Any idea by how much RCN prices drift down for every 1,000 tons of RCN SS stock?
RCN prices won't respond to 1,000 tons of stock. So the international RCN trade is around 2.2 million tons, maybe even this year. So it responds to much broader trends. So it's much more complex than saying as material comes to the market, the price will go up or go down. Don't forget, we've had years when there were excellent crops and still prices went sky high based on a sentiment, a miscalculation, a perception of shortage. So I don't think we can, and I don't think you could do that in any market. So it would be very difficult to calculate how any given volume arriving into the market would influence that market.
Thank you, Jim. Before I continue with the ones that I have coming in from the other outlets, we have one question here in the Q&A feature. What is causing Tanzania RCN much more expensive for its kernels to compete in the world market? Is it logistics or protection, as you mentioned? And why is African investment in value addition not happening? As you said, are organizations doing something to get African cashews out of that trauma?
Well, first of all, Tanzanian raw cashew nuts are higher priced because they're high quality, because they arrive into the market during the thin season, if you like. Only about 18% of the crop is harvested between October and January. Tanzanian raw cashew nuts are pretty high quality. Yeah, there is an element of protectionism. There is a high export duty on raw cashew nuts from Tanzania, about $160 per ton. Whether that's paid for by the international trade or by the farmer is always a discussion. If we compare the price of Tanzanian raw cashew nuts to other origins, they look reasonable value compared to the others, notwithstanding maybe the market's a little bit high today, but generally they look reasonable value based on quality. So it's outturn, it's count, but also it's the processing characteristics, the taste, and all of those factors that are known to processors.
Thank you, Jim. Just a moment, let me check. We have another question here, and it says, clearly the extra value added is with the roasters. Any idea how much of the gross margin indicated is represented by the net margin, as the operational cost of roasters may turn out to be very high?
Yeah, I think we could say, first of all, I think we could say that it's probably a fair comment to say that roasters don't make huge margins for food manufacturers. Supermarkets dominate the industry. I think roasters make relatively tight margins. What they try to do is they try to increase their volumes. So you've got roasters who do private labels. So they do a label for a supermarket, and that would be normally agreed on a large tender, and the margins are very tight in that. On the other hand, you have branded products, and products, you can see some of the branded products here. You have branded products, and those branded products, the gross margins would be higher. The fact is, however, it takes a lot of money and a lot of time to build a brand. And you can't build a brand just on a single product. You need a range of products. So if we look at margins, I've heard gross margins for roasters anywhere from 30% down to 18%, and net margins as low as 2-3%. So it's a way to add value. It's a way to increase your profit margin, but it depends on which model you choose. So it's the idea of, really high volume, low margin business to start doesn't make a huge amount of sense. What maybe makes sense would be lower volume, niche, where you're looking for a higher price, higher return, telling a different story and offering a different product.
Jim, the same person would, want you to emphasize more why African investment in value addition not happening.
African investment in value addition through primary processing, I think it is happening. I mean, I think if we look around and we talk about primary processing first, if you look around Tanzania, I know of 3-4 projects happening right now. We know in Ivory Coast there's so much going on. We know that people are looking in other countries. It's not an easy one, and it's been a long time in coming. That's true. And that's complex. I mean, we heard Serge talk to us about people, about managing people, managing machines, managing food safety and certification. He also mentioned finance. These are all difficult areas. But one of the lessons coming out of 2020 and 2021 is that African processors who are qualified, in other words, have all of those factors in place, and I'd add probably a good marketing approach too. It is working, and it is increasing.
Okay, thank you, Jim. The last question, maybe we can also ask the audience if they would like to, ask you a question directly. The last question says, Africa has lost ground in respect of US imports of kernels. Is it the case of declining kernel export from Africa, or diversification of African kernel exports to EU and the Middle East?
Well, I think it's fair to say that African exporters have a larger share of the European market than they have of the US market at this time. I think probably the share in the EU market has been increasing. But for me, a lot of it is about that match between price, markets, and quality. And if we look, it's probably fair to say that the US market is more a price sensitive market than the European market. And for that reason, perhaps ground has been lost in the US. But I think also part of it is not getting the message out and not marketing well, not presenting the product well, not presenting the product in a way that's interesting to US buyers. And I do see examples of successful marketing in the US. The other thing I think is that the option toward going toward this Burma kernels, sending unpeeled kernels to Vietnam, I think that's had a huge impact. And I think that that has probably been one of the factors that's reduced trade to the United States for African processors. The product ends up in Vietnam, half processed, and probably does go to the United States, but it goes to the United States as Vietnamese.
Thank you, Jim, for the response. Another question just asked, somebody wants to know about the US East and West Coast split.
In terms of demand, okay. I don't know the exact split. I do know that in general, the home of the cashew business in the United States would be on the East Coast. There would be more roasting. Now, the imports may well come through West Coast ports because that makes sense from Vietnam. So if you're importing, I know of cases, East Coast based roasters or Midwest based roasters, where their imports come through Los Angeles, Long Beach. That's the decision of the shipping line, how to route it. But then it does leave the challenge of getting hold of that container, getting it on a train or on a truck, moving it to a terminal along the way. And that's proven to be an enormous challenge. I know buyers who have containers of cashews stuck at railheads that are within a few miles of their facilities, but they're unable to get them moved for processing. And that's been a big issue. So whereas I'm sorry, I can't give you an exact answer on the split, what I can say, processing, roasting is more of an East Coast activity than a West Coast activity. Imports have tended nowadays, once upon a time it was all New York, New Jersey, but nowadays it's also West Coast as Vietnam has taken more and more hold on the market share. And bear in mind, Vietnam has about an 89% share of the US market. It was up as high as 90 in September.
Thank you very much, Jim. We have duly exhausted all the questions, but if anybody wants to ask or interact with Jim live, you may use the raise hand feature and then we'll call you in. Or if you still have questions that you would want Jim to address or a need for clarification, please use the Q&A feature. Okay, there's a hand up. Mr. Mario, please, can you hear me? Hello, Mr. Mario, can you hear me? If you can hear me, can you unmute yourself and ask your question? Hello, can you hear me? I see you've unmuted yourself. Please go ahead and ask your question. I think Mr. Mario might have technical challenges, but we have another hand that is up. Isaac, so I'm going to grant you permission to speak now, and I would need you to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. My question is in regard to logistics. I don't know whether Jim can lighten us what is happening currently in terms of shipments for the cashews around the world. I remember the other time he did actually indicate what was happening, and it was a challenge. But I don't know, as the pandemic is still there, and of course some easing in some places, that could be much better for us to understand the situation currently. Hello?
Hello, Isaac. Yes, I can hear you. Could you please repeat your question? Jim
Yes,
was
fine.
open.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Please go ahead.
I'm asking about the logistics in terms of shipments. Is that situation easing by now, given the past experience where we were facing a lot of difficulties in terms of shipping the cashew around the world?
Yeah, okay. It has the situation eased? Not really. The situation has definitely stabilized. The container rates are stuck around very high levels. I mean, you're looking today at about $8,000 for a 20-foot container from Vietnam to Europe, compared to rates as low as $600 going back a couple of years. So this is a huge increase, and that remains in place, and that is having an impact on the way buyers regard the market. There are also still problems in the ports of arrival. Problems, we were talking about the US West Coast, particularly having problems, but there are problems in ports everywhere as they work through a huge volume of containers. So you've got a buildup of containers in the ports of destination. You've got that still persists. You have a situation where ports are trying to clear containers, but then you have the difficulty of trains, trucks, moving them on. That's more acute in the United States than it is in Europe for the time being. And this is not likely to go away anytime soon. We're likely to see high rates, congestion. We're likely to see slow and long journey times persisting well into next year, according to the freight lines. I think it's had an impact. I mean, don't forget, we are seeing record shipments of kernels, but buyers have been smart and they've got out what they needed as soon as they could. And so it hasn't caused the market to come to a standstill. It's been reasonably well managed, but at high cost. So expect disruptions to continue. There is a question some people are asking as to whether freight rates will ever return to where they were before. And you know, when you look at it now, it's hard to imagine that freight rates could come down to the levels that they were 2 years ago. So I think the disruptions continue. They are stabilized, maybe easing a little bit, but that we will see continued disruptions for some time to come.
Thank you.
Blessing. Okay, I hope you can hear me.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can
Hello?
hear you now.
Okay.
Any more questions, Blessing?
No, that will be all. That's all. We've exhausted all. So please,
Okay.
including words together, you and Serge.
Thanks very much to everyone for their questions. My particular thanks to Serge for giving us that very interesting input today. I'm a big admirer of Talaro and what you're doing. I wish you continued success. And anyone who wants to see a nice cashew website about value addition and covering a whole range of issues, have a look at Talaro's website. So merci beaucoup, Serge. Thank you all for being with us today. I guess we're going to see a period of relatively quiet market over the next couple of weeks. I look forward to being back with you again. It's the 1st of December, yes, it is. And on the 1st of December, we're going to take a look back at 2021 and we look forward to 2022. So thanks very much for joining us. Thanks to everyone who asked questions or made comments. And I'm looking forward to talking to you again soon. All the best for now. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Jim. And thank you to our intervener that joined us all the way from Benin, Mr. Serge. Thank you, of course, to you, our participants, for joining us. We look forward to hosting you again on the 1st of December, where we are looking back on 2021 and looking forward to 2022. And until then, we ask that you mask up and stay safe. Bye-bye.